These are 20 more hidden facts about the man who shot Liberty Valance, the 1962 Western that most fans believe they already understand completely. The stories behind the cast and crew who made it, the struggles they carried on to that Paramount soundstage, and the lives they lived before and after filming are still largely unknown, even among dedicated fans of the film, and that's what we're covering today. The first video on this channel covered how Paramount forced Wayne's casting, how Ford tormented his stars throughout the shoot, how the black and white look came from budget cuts rather than any artistic vision, and how the famous line about printing the legend never appeared in Dorothy Johnson's original story. Today we go considerably deeper. We're talking about the actor who reported to work while his memory was already failing him, the actress who lost 2 defining roles to pregnancy, the 3 Liberty Valance villains filming a Twilight Zone episode at the exact same moment they were making this Western, and Woody Strode's final act of loyalty to the man who had both elevated and tormented him. Let's get into it. Fact number 1. Edmond O'Brien came to the set while recovering from a heart attack. Edmond O'Brien plays Dutton Peabody, the hard-drinking newspaper editor whose courage under pressure gives the film some of its most affecting moments, and the performance earned him an Academy Award nomination. What almost nobody knows is what condition he was in when he arrived to film it. Before Liberty Valance went into production, O'Brien had suffered a heart attack on the set of Lawrence of Arabia, which cost him that role and put him in recovery. Arthur Kennedy replaced him in that production, and O'Brien arrived on Ford's picture while his body was still healing from a serious cardiac episode, which would have been enough on its own to explain why the shoot was difficult for him. That wasn't the only thing affecting him, though. Colleagues who worked closely with O'Brien during this period noticed his eyesight deteriorating and his memory failing in ways that went beyond ordinary forgetfulness, and looking back with the medical knowledge we have now, those were the early signs of what would later be confirmed as Alzheimer's disease. Despite all of that, O'Brien appeared in 4 films released in 1962 alone, and the Academy deemed his Liberty Valance work worthy of nomination. The man delivering those lines about truth and the freedom of the press was fighting battles that had nothing to do with the frontier, and he showed up anyway and did the work. Fact number 2. Vera Miles lost the Vertigo role to pregnancy, and it cost her everything. Vera Miles brings a quiet, deeply human dignity to Hallie, the woman caught between Tom Doniphan and Ransom Stoddard, and her casting in Liberty Valance came after one of the more painful professional reversals in Hollywood history. Alfred Hitchcock had chosen Miles as his ideal leading lady for Vertigo, the psychological thriller now regularly ranked among the greatest films ever made. Costume tests were completed, and the role was hers, and then she became pregnant. Kim Novak stepped in, delivered a performance that film schools have analyzed for decades, and Vertigo became the kind of credit that defines careers. Hitchcock's reaction to being replaced by a pregnancy was not gracious, and his response effectively ended any future professional relationship between them. The woman positioned to become one of the great Hitchcock heroines found that door shut permanently, and she came to Liberty Valance carrying the weight of that. Ford recognized something in Miles that rewarded restraint and subtlety rather than spectacle, and what she does with Hallie, the way decades of unspoken feeling register in her face without a word of explanation, remains one of the film's quietest and most powerful achievements. Fact number 3. Ford banned Stewart from wearing his cowboy hat as an act of revenge. James Stewart's character arrives at the Shinbone Railroad station wearing a small, unimpressive hat that looks nothing like the broad-brimmed gear audiences expected on a Western hero of his standing. Critics read this as deliberate costume symbolism, Ford's way of marking Stoddard as an outsider in a frontier world. The actual explanation is considerably more entertaining. Ford and Stewart had worked together on Two Rode Together in 1961, and that production had been troubled throughout. One recurring point of friction was Stewart's cowboy hat, which Ford considered the worst-looking piece of headwear he had ever seen on an actor, and he told Stewart so repeatedly. Stewart defended the hat with equal stubbornness, which meant the argument never resolved, it just transferred to the next production. By the time Liberty Valance began, Ford settled the dispute by removing any hat from the picture entirely. What critics read as symbolic costume design was the continuation of a petty feud between 2 strong-willed men who had been arguing about headwear for months, and the accidental genius of it is that Ford's revenge produced exactly the visual effect the film needed. The hatless Stoddard does look like an outsider. He does stand apart from the world around him. Ford got what he needed by refusing to give Stewart what he wanted. Fact number 4. Lee Marvin built his menace on speed. Lee Marvin's Liberty Valance ranks among cinema's most frightening villains, and the technique behind that threat was more deliberate and thought out than anything audiences would guess from watching the finished film. In an interview with journalist Robert Ward, Marvin explained his approach with precision. "I move faster on screen, creates danger. Where other actors playing menace reach for stillness or slow deliberateness, Marvin went the opposite direction entirely, moving quickly and unpredictably, so audiences could never quite track where he was going or what he was about to do." Marvin also praised Ford's decision to use oversized props throughout the production. The whip Liberty Valance carries, the guns, the physical objects in his hands are slightly larger than realistic scale would suggest, and Marvin understood that those exaggerated props made him look more dominant relative to the space around him, amplifying his physical presence without requiring any additional performance work to achieve the effect. The combination of that speed and those props created a character who feels genuinely dangerous in a way that technique alone might never have managed. And now that you know the mechanics of it, watch what Marvin does the next time you put the film on and see if you can catch the moment the danger registers before you can fully explain why. Fact number 5. Lee Marvin got thrown out of the actor's studio for knowing too much. Lee Strasberg's Actors Studio was the most prestigious acting institution in America during the 1950s and early 60s, and its method acting philosophy produced Marlon Brando and James Dean, and a generation of performers who transformed what American screen acting could be. Getting accepted to the Actors Studio represented a genuine achievement. Getting thrown out was something else entirely, and that's exactly what happened to Lee Marvin. During a session at the Actors Studio, an exercise involving gangrene came up as part of a method exploration. The problem was that Marvin had served as a scout sniper in the Pacific during World War II, had been seriously wounded at Saipan, and had encountered actual gangrene in ways that left no room for theoretical interpretation. When an instructor made a claim about the condition that Marvin knew from direct combat experience to be wrong, he said so. The institution did not appreciate being corrected by a student, particularly when Strasberg's theoretical knowledge was being challenged by someone who had seen the real thing in a military hospital. Marvin was removed from the program. The irony is one worth sitting with. The man thrown out of America's most prestigious acting school for knowing too much went on to build one of the most respected careers in Hollywood history, and his performance as Liberty Valance demonstrates more vividly than any diploma could that he needed no institution's approval to understand how genuine menace works on screen. Fact number 6. The co-art director chose an internment camp over studio protection. Co-art director Eddie Imazu shaped the visual world of Shinbone and the surrounding frontier, and his Academy Award nomination for The Great Ziegfeld in 1936 had established him as a recognized craftsman in Hollywood long before Liberty Valance went into production. What World War II did to his life in between those two credits is what makes his biography extraordinary. After Pearl Harbor, Imazu faced a choice that no Japanese American on the West Coast was truly free to make. MGM, where his professional standing might have offered some measure of protection, was available to him. His family was not going to MGM though, and Imazu refused to leave them behind. He went to the internment camps, choosing his family over his career without apparent hesitation. Louis B. Mayer personally welcomed him back to the studio when the war ended, a gesture that carried real meaning given what Imazu had given up and why. The sets Imazu helped design for a Western about justice and civilization were created by a man who had lived through the denial of both, and that biography dwarfs anything John Ford put on screen. Fact number 7. The cinematographer filmed real bombing missions over Germany. William Clothier shot Liberty Valance across 22 John Wayne films, and earned a reputation as one of the most trusted cinematographers in Hollywood. Before any of that, his life had taken him to places that most people in the film industry could not have imagined surviving. During World War II, Clothier served as a combat cameraman on the Memphis Belle documentary, which meant accompanying one of the most famous American bomber crews of the war on actual runs over occupied Europe. The flak filling the sky around those aircraft was genuine, and the danger Clothier faced holding his camera in those conditions was as real as danger gets, and that was not his first brush with it. During the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, Clothier had been imprisoned while covering a conflict that most of his contemporaries experienced only through newspaper accounts. Rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel before his military service ended, Clothier brought a perspective to his camera work that no film school produces. Adjusting an angle on a Paramount soundstage to capture John Wayne and James Stewart in the right light was a routine professional challenge for a man who had previously adjusted his camera inside a bomber over Germany, and whatever Ford's production threw at him, he had already survived considerably worse. Fact number 8. 3 Liberty Valance villains filmed a Twilight Zone episode at the same time. The fall of 1961 kept certain actors very busy in very similar ways. Lee Marvin, Strother Martin, and Lee Van Cleef all appear in Liberty Valance as criminals and threatening figures in the frontier world of Shinbone, and during the exact same period when Ford was filming them on the Paramount lot, all three appeared together in a Twilight Zone episode called The Grave. That episode aired on October 27, 1961, placing its production squarely within Liberty Valance's shoot, which ran from September through November of that year. Three men playing Frontier Menace in one production were simultaneously playing Frontier Menace in another, and audiences watching Rod Serling's anthology series would have seen the same faces making them uneasy on television, during the weeks when those faces were also making their way through Ford's Western, without either production apparently viewing the scheduling overlap as a problem worth addressing. What this tells you about the acting pool for a certain kind of role in 1961 is that it was smaller than it looked from the outside. If you needed a convincing frontier threat, you called specific people, and apparently both John Ford and the Twilight Zone were calling the same three men at the same time that fall. Fact number 9. Woody Strode slept on Ford's floor for the final 4 months of his life. Ford used Strode as a weapon against Wayne throughout the Liberty Valance shoot, pointing at the former NFL player to remind Wayne that Strode had earned real athletic credentials while Wayne had only played at them. The set was not always a comfortable place for Strode, and the relationship between director and actor carried the weight of that throughout production. None of that is what defines what existed between them. In the final months of John Ford's life, Strode moved in and became his caregiver. 4 months of sleeping on Ford's floor, attending to the needs of the man who had both elevated him and made his life difficult. When Ford died on August 31, 1973, Strode was there at the bedside. Standard Hollywood vocabulary struggles to account for that kind of loyalty. These were not men who had simply enjoyed working together, and the Liberty Valance production had included genuine tension and calculated cruelty directed at Strode. And yet when Ford needed someone to show up and stay, Strode was the one who answered. Whatever complicated mixture of respect and grievance and genuine feeling had accumulated between them across their years together, Strode resolved it by being present at the end, and that deserves to be remembered alongside anything that happened on camera. Fact number 10. Ford's iconic eye patch was self-inflicted. The eye patch over Ford's left eye became as iconic as any prop in classic Hollywood. Photographs of Ford on set almost always feature it, and it became part of the visual shorthand for what a serious and uncompromising director looked like. Most people assume it was a war injury, or a condition that emerged naturally with age. Cataract surgery before the Searchers in 1956 required Ford to keep bandages over his eye during recovery to allow proper healing. Ford tore the bandages off too early. The eye never healed correctly as a result, and permanent loss of use of his left eye followed directly from his own refusal to follow straightforward medical instructions. By the time Liberty Valance was being filmed, Ford had spent several years seeing the world through one functional eye, directing some of the most visually composed films in Hollywood history, while working with half the visual information available to the average person. The eye patch that critics and historians have read as a symbol of the tough, uncompromising auteur was the consequence of a man who couldn't be bothered to wait for his body to heal, and somehow that makes it feel more like him rather than less. Fact number 11. Strother Martin nearly made the Olympic diving team. Strother Martin plays Floyd in Liberty Valance with that sharp, watchful, weasel-faced presence that makes a Western feel genuinely populated rather than simply cast, and he was a consummate character actor who brought specificity and real life to every small role he inhabited. Before all of that, Martin was a competitive diver of serious accomplishment who came close to representing the United States at the highest level the sport offers. National Junior Springboard Diving Champion in 1936, Martin finished third at the national championships and came close enough to the 1948 Olympic team that the Games represented a genuine possibility rather than a distant dream. During the years when his acting career was still building, he taught swimming to Charlie Chaplin's children, which placed him in the orbit of one of the most famous entertainers who ever lived. He also appeared as a leprechaun on a television program called Mabel's Fables during the period before his film work took hold. National diving champion, near Olympian, swimming instructor to the children of Charlie Chaplin, and one of the finest character actors the Western genre ever produced. That's the full picture of who was playing Floyd in the background of Ford's masterpiece. The score for this film sat in a vault for over 50 years before a limited run of 1,000 copies made it available to the public, and if that fact surprised you, hit the subscribe button right now. We cover the hidden histories of classic Hollywood every week, and there is always more to find. Fact number 12. Paramount tried to remake the film in 2015. Liberty Valance is so deeply rooted in the mythology of the American West that imagining a remake feels almost disrespectful to the original, and yet Paramount Pictures attempted one in 2015 and got surprisingly far into the process before the project quietly died. Screenwriter Terrence Winter was attached to develop a new version, and the studio's conceptual approach to the material was ambitious rather than lazy. The new version would have relocated the story to 1980s Pennsylvania and 1991 New York City during the crack epidemic, with the Ransom Stoddard figure reimagined as a black police officer and the Tom Donovan character reimagined as an Irish cop. The thematic ambition behind that pitch deserves acknowledgement, because the parallels between the frontier West and the urban battlegrounds of the crack epidemic represent legitimate creative territory, rather than simple nostalgia mining, and taking Ford's meditation on law and the price of civilization into that context showed genuine creative thinking. The project was never produced, and it joined the long list of Hollywood developments that existed as announcements before quietly disappearing. For a moment, though, someone at Paramount looked at a 1962 Western and saw something they believed could speak to a completely different America, and they weren't wrong about the themes. Fact number 13. Carolyn Jones was originally announced as the female lead. Vera Miles inhabits Hallie with such conviction that the role feels like it was written for her. And yet the Los Angeles Times ran an announcement on April 29, 1961, listing Carolyn Jones as the female lead. This was not a rumor or speculation. It was a production announcement published in one of the entertainment industry's primary newspapers of record, naming a different actress entirely for the role that Miles would ultimately make her own. At some point between that announcement and the start of filming in September, Miles replaced Jones, and the circumstances of that change have not been extensively documented. What changed the picture decisively is harder to trace than the fact that the change happened. Ford's use of Alfred Newman's Anne Rutledge theme from his own 1939 film Young Mr. Lincoln added a layer of meaning that only attentive listeners would catch. That theme was originally written to evoke Abraham Lincoln's grief over a lost love, and Ford repurposed it for Hallie's scenes to communicate what the dialogue left unspoken, that decades of marriage to Ransom Stoddard had not made her stop loving Tom Donovan. The musical choice carried the emotional weight the script declined to spell out directly, and Ford used it to say something true about Hallie that the screenplay never quite got around to saying for itself. Fact number 14. Ford deliberately built a claustrophobic film rather than an epic one. Ford built his reputation on landscapes. Monument valleys, buttes, and mesas beneath enormous skies define the visual grammar of the classic American Western, and his command of that landscape produced some of the most beautiful images the cinema has ever captured. Liberty Valance does something deliberately and completely different from all of that. On September 14, 1961, Ford told Daily Variety that he was making a close-up type picture, and that phrase captures the entire visual philosophy of what he was building. The film is confined, interior, and hemmed in ways that feel nothing like The Searchers or Stagecoach. Scenes play out in small rooms and narrow streets, and the world of Shinbone never opens into the expansiveness audiences had come to expect from this director. Film critic Andrew Sarris recognized the choice and praised what he called the film's remarkable austerity, understanding that Ford had stripped away the grandeur his reputation was built on and replaced it with something more spare and more honest about the territory it was mapping. Martin Scorsese later posed the film's central question with characteristic directness: what defines a man? Stewart or Wayne? Actually both. The confined visual space of Liberty Valance forces that question onto the characters because there is nowhere to run from it, and the greatest landscape director in Hollywood history chose to make his most personal Western inside a box. Fact number 15. The film's score was locked in a vault for over 50 years. Cyril Mockridge composed the score for Liberty Valance, and his music was recorded in January of 1962, just before the film's release. The score underscores many of the film's most emotionally weighted moments and plays a real role in creating the atmosphere audiences respond to, which makes what happened to it afterward genuinely strange. For more than 50 years following that January recording session, the score was never commercially released in any form. Film soundtracks had been released as albums for decades by then, and the market for that kind of music was well established. Mockridge's Liberty Valance score sat in a vault regardless, unavailable to anyone who wanted to own it. Kritzerland Records finally released it in 2014, and the pressing was limited to 1,000 copies. Those 1,000 copies sold out, and the album became a collector's item among film music enthusiasts. The complete commercial history of the musical score for one of the most celebrated American Westerns ever made amounts to 1,000 copies available 52 years after filming wrapped, and if you missed that window, you are looking at the secondary market now. Fact number 16. Edmond O'Brien learned magic from Harry Houdini. Harry Houdini lived next door to the young Edmond O'Brien, and the most famous escape artist and illusionist in the world took an interest in the boy and tutored him personally in the art of magic. That's where O'Brien's extraordinary career began, with sleight-of-hand lessons from the man whose name became synonymous with impossible feats. Broadway followed, and O'Brien played Mercutio opposite Laurence Olivier's Romeo in a production that placed him on stage alongside the actor who would become widely regarded as the greatest Shakespearean performer of the 20th century. O'Brien was not overwhelmed. Mercutio is one of Shakespeare's most demanding and beloved comic roles, and he delivered it against the best competition the English-speaking stage could put in front of him. Orson Welles' Mercury Theatre production of Julius Caesar then cast O'Brien as Mark Antony, giving him another defining stage credit alongside a director who was himself building toward legend. Houdini's pupil, Olivier's Mercutio, Welles's Antony, and then, recovering from a heart attack with his memory beginning to slip, O'Brien came to a Paramount soundstage and gave a performance the Academy judged worthy of nomination. The arc of that life from a neighbor's magic lessons to an Oscar nomination is one the film itself never had room to tell. Fact number 17. Lee Marvin shares an ancestor with George Washington and is buried at Allington. On June 18, 1944, enemy fire severed Lee Marvin's sciatic nerve during the fighting on Saipan, where he served as a scout sniper in I Company, 3rd Battalion 24th Marines, 4th Division. His company entered that engagement with 247 men and came out with 6 survivors after 15 minutes of combat. 13 months in military hospitals followed, and the damage to his sciatic nerve was permanent, causing him chronic pain for the rest of his working life. Arlington National Cemetery is where Marvin was buried, an honor reserved for those whose service meets the highest standard the nation applies to its military dead. Genealogical research has since established that Marvin and George Washington shared a common ancestor, connecting the man who plays the most memorable villain in this film about American justice and frontier law to the man who first embodied American leadership by bloodline. Every scene Marvin played in Liberty Valance was filtered through the knowledge of what real violence costs and what genuine danger feels like from the inside. The menace he projected on Ford's soundstage wasn't manufactured from imagination alone. It came from a man who had survived things that killed 241 of his fellow Marines in 15 minutes. Fact number 18. Woody Strode inspired the name of a Pixar hero. At UCLA, Strode played alongside Jackie Robinson and Kenny Washington, a group so gifted that their teammates and opponents collectively called them the Gold Dust Gang. In 1946, Strode and Washington joined the Los Angeles Rams and became 2 of the first black players in the National Football League in 13 years, integrating professional football a year before Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. After football, Strode became Pacific Coast heavyweight wrestling champion in 1952. Pixar named the main character of Toy Story after Woody Strode. The name Woody, as applied to a heroic figure in an American Western context, traces directly back to this man. Writing in the academic journal Black Camera in 2012, scholar Abigail Horn argued that Strode's character Pompey in Liberty Valance presents what she called a sturdier masculine identity than the leading white men in the film. That reading challenges the conventional treatment of Pompey as a marginal supporting figure and suggests that what Strode accomplishes in the film has consistently received less serious attention than it deserves. NFL pioneer, wrestling champion, UCLA legend, the man who gave a Pixar hero his name, and an actor whose quiet strength in Liberty Valance a scholar would later argue outstrips his more celebrated co-stars. Fact number 19. Liberty Valance was the first of 3 Wayne and Stewart films. 2 of the biggest Western stars in Hollywood history had built parallel careers for decades without ever appearing in the same film, and Liberty Valance marked the first time Wayne and Stewart shared a screen. 2 more collaborations followed, with How the West Was Won arriving later in 1962, and The Shootist coming in 1976. By the time The Shootist was made, Stewart was dealing with severe hearing loss, and his participation in Wayne's final film came from friendship rather than professional calculation. Wayne asked, and Stewart came, because some things carry more weight than the practical difficulties of showing up when your hearing has significantly deteriorated. Wayne died in 1979, and the friendship between them, which began on Ford's troubled production in the fall of 1961, held until the end. Watching Wayne and Stewart navigate their complicated dynamic in Liberty Valance, the unspoken negotiation between their 2 very different kinds of masculinity, you are watching the beginning of a relationship that lasted until one of them was gone. knowing that changes what's on screen in ways that reward a second viewing. Fact number 20. Dorothy Johnson published as DM Johnson to hide her gender. Dorothy Marie Johnson sold her first story to the Saturday Evening Post in 1930 for $400, and what followed was 11 years of rejection before her career found its footing again. 11 years of being told no by editors who, as historian Steve Brown later put it, couldn't believe a woman could write these violent, bare-knuckled stories. Johnson's solution was practical and quietly devastating. She published as DM Johnson, removing the name Marie because she felt it was too frilly for the kind of work she was doing, and because she understood that hiding her gender was the price of being taken seriously in the markets she needed. The Blackfoot tribe made Johnson an honorary member in 1959, recognizing years of genuine engagement with and respect for the culture she wrote about, rather than simple exploitation of it for plot material. In October of 1982, she published an essay in Writer's Digest titled "The Woman Who Shot Liberty Valance," examining what the adaptation had meant and what it had changed, and the title alone tells you exactly how clearly she understood her own invisibility in the mythology surrounding the film. Johnson died in 1984 from Parkinson's disease, and the Western Writers of America ranked her original Liberty Valance story as #1 among the top 5 Western stories of the 20th century. The woman who spent over a decade being rejected, who hid her gender to get published, who signed her work with initials rather than her name, wrote the story at the foundation of one of the greatest American films ever made. Let's look at what we've put together here. An actor arrived to work recovering from a heart attack, while the early signs of Alzheimer's were already affecting him, and still earned an Oscar nomination. An actress lost 2 iconic roles to pregnancy, one of them Vertigo, and came to Ford's picture anyway, and gave him exactly what he needed. 3 of the film's villains were simultaneously filming a Twilight Zone episode during the same weeks they were making this Western, because the pool of actors who could credibly threaten you on a frontier in 1961 was smaller than it appeared. A cinematographer had filmed real bombing missions over Germany before he ever touched a Hollywood camera. An art director chose an internment camp over studio protection because he refused to leave his family behind. A character actor came within reach of the Olympic diving team before he ever stood in front of a camera. A director's iconic eye patch was the direct consequence of his own refusal to let a cataract surgery heal properly. A score sat locked in a vault for more than 50 years before 1,000 copies made it briefly available to the public. A studio attempted a remake set during the crack epidemic and never got it made. A casting announcement published in the Los Angeles Times named a completely different actress for the female lead. The greatest landscape director in Hollywood history deliberately chose claustrophobia over grandeur and called it a close-up type picture. Lee Marvin, descended from the same ancestor as George Washington, buried at Arlington National Cemetery, thrown out of the actor's studio for knowing too much, built his menace on speed and survived Saipan, when 241 of his fellow Marines did not. Woody Strode integrated the NFL, became a wrestling champion, inspired the name of a Pixar hero, and slept on Ford's floor for 4 months to care for the man who had made his life difficult and whom he chose to stand by at the end. James Stewart came to the shootist with severe hearing loss because his friend asked him to. Dorothy Johnson published under initials rather than her name for over a decade, and wrote the story that made all of this possible. The Legend of the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is a smooth collaboration between giants of Hollywood cinema, a seamless meeting of talents at the peak of their powers. The truth involves battle-damaged veterans, career-defining losses, petty feuds about cowboy hats, scores locked away in vaults, and a woman who hid her gender for a decade to get published. Every person who contributed to that film brought a life story that dwarfed anything Ford put on screen, and understanding that makes the finished product more worth watching rather than less, because they created something lasting despite what they were carrying, not in the absence of it. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. But the truth turns out to be worth printing too. If this look at the real stories behind The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance gave you something you didn't know before, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We do this every week, finding the human histories that the standard accounts of classic Hollywood leave out, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Leave a comment below and tell me which of these facts hit hardest. Was it Strother Martin nearly making the Olympics? O'Brien learning magic from Houdini? Strode sleeping on Ford's floor at the end? Those comments tell me what matters to you and help me find more of the same. And if you have a friend who grew up watching these films, share the video with him because he is going to want to know these things. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.